October afternoon, 1880, the iron rails of Oak Haven Station, Montana Territory. The steam had barely cleared when a gaunt woman stepped off the train with nothing but a carpet bag and a spine made of something unbreakable. The man waiting for her was broad, weathered, jaw carved from granite. "I needed someone to carry the weight of a ranch," he said, flat as a cast iron pan. "They sent me a starved bird." Laughter broke from the boardwalk. She didn't flinch. Brown eyes locked onto his steady, unblinking, unafraid. "I didn't cross 5 states to look pretty for you, Coulter. I came to work." The laughter died. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer, a woman who arrived with nothing and left her mark on everything. Stay with us to find out what she did to that ranch, and to the man who thought his heart had turned to stone. The train pulled into Oak Haven just past 2 in the afternoon, breathing steam like an exhausted animal. Evelyn Mercer stepped off the iron steps with a single carpetbag in her hand and a posture that said she had not come all this way to be apologized to. 5 days on the rails from Columbus, 5 days of hard wooden benches, coal smoke, and other passengers who barely looked at her. She had slept sitting up. She had eaten bread and dried apple, and she had not complained to a single soul. Montana Territory greeted her with a sky too wide and a wind too cold, the kind of cold that walks right through a coat. She stood on the platform and took it in. The mountains sat in the distance like something permanent and unimpressed. The town of Oak Haven spread out before her raw timber storefronts, a muddy main street, horses hitched to rails, men moving between buildings, with that particular efficiency of people who have too much work and too little daylight. It was not beautiful. It was not welcoming. But Evie Mercer had not expected beauty. She had expected work that she could do. She spotted him immediately. He stood apart from the small crowd gathered near the station, a tall man, broad through the shoulders with a jaw that looked carved from something ungentle. 38 years old, but weathered closer to 50 in the face. He wore a gray wool coat that had seen better decades, and he held his hat in his hands, which she noticed were rough and scarred. Working hands. Good. That meant he was not a man who let others carry what he could carry himself. His eyes found her at the same moment hers found him. Jedediah Coulter looked at Evelyn Mercer for exactly 3 seconds. He took in the coarse gray dress, the gaunt face, the dark circles beneath steady brown eyes, the frame that had clearly missed more meals than it had eaten, and whatever he had been hoping for, whatever image he had built in his head. Over those weeks of letters, it collapsed right there on the platform. His expression did not soften to hide it. "I needed someone to carry the weight of a ranch," he said, his voice flat as a cast iron pan, not a porcelain doll. "And they sent me a starved bird." From the boardwalk along the station front, somebody laughed. Then a few more. A group of men stood there, some local, some not, all of them watching with the particular pleasure of people who enjoy other people's misfortune. Sterling's men, a couple of them, though Evie did not know that yet. And mixed among them, townspeople who simply had nowhere better to be. "Look at her," one of them called out, a heavy-set man with a red face and tobacco in his cheek. "First winter, blizzard's gonna break her in 2. Another one, leaning against a post. "She'll never belong here." Laughter rippled through them. Easy, careless laughter. The kind people use when they want to belong to something, even if that something is only cruelty. Evie did not look at them. She kept her eyes on Jed. She let him finish. Let the laughter run its course. Let the air settle. Then she said, clear and even, "I didn't travel across 5 states to look pretty for you, Mr. Coulter. I came to work, and I've never backed down from any man who breathes." The laughter on the boardwalk went a little quieter. Jed said nothing. He studied her face for a moment, really looked at it, and whatever he found there, it did not entirely please him, but it did not entirely not please him either. He turned and started walking toward a waiting wagon. Without another word, she followed. That was how it began. The wagon ride out to Ironwood Basin was 40 minutes of near silence. Jed drove. Evie sat beside him on the bench and watched the landscape unfold. Tall grass going golden brown, aspens shaking their last leaves loose, creek beds cutting through pale rock, ravens sitting on fence posts like small judges. She thought about Ohio, about the two-room house in Columbus where she had spent the last 4 years managing her father's debts and her mother's illness simultaneously, running numbers on scraps of paper at the kitchen table after midnight, boiling herbs when she could not afford the doctor, watching her mother grow smaller week by week until there was nothing left to watch. After the funeral, there had been nothing left to stay for, and not much money to go anywhere with. The advertisement had been simple. Montana rancher seeks capable woman to manage household and assist with ranch operations. Hard work expected. Fair treatment guaranteed. She had written back that same evening. She had never managed a ranch before, but she had managed poverty. That was harder. "How many men do you have working the place?" she asked. Jed's eyes stayed on the road. 15 hands. "And the house? How is it run?" "It runs." She let that sit. "What happened to your first wife?" His jaw tightened. That was all. She did not push. The mountains were closing in around them now, the road narrowing between timber and rock. The light was starting to go gold at the edges, the way it does in autumn when the afternoon gives up early. And then Ironwood Basin Ranch came into view, around a long bend, and Evie took it in without expression, though she felt something shift in her chest. Not quite sorrow, not quite recognition. It was bigger than she had imagined. That was good, but it was also harder looking. The main house was 2 stories of dark timber, solid but graceless. A barn stood to the left, large and practical. Fences ran in every direction. Corrals, outbuildings. A bunkhouse with light showing in one window. And over everything, a feeling of, she searched for the word. Neglect was not quite right. It was more like grief that had been converted into labor. Like someone had stopped caring about the place as a home and only continued with it as a function. The men came out when the wagon pulled in, some curious, some not. They looked at her, the way men look at something unexpected, sizing it up, deciding before they know anything what box it belongs in. She climbed down from the wagon herself, before anyone offered a hand, picked up her carpet bag, stood in the yard. Foreman Gideon Hayes came forward from the group, 50 gray at the temples, a face that had known hard years and made peace with them. He had the bearing of a man who had commanded things, lines, troops, livestock, people, and had done it quietly enough that most folks forgot he was commanding anything. He nodded at her. "Ma'am, Gideon Hayes?" she asked. "That's right, Evelyn Mercer." She looked around at the others, 15 men approximately, a few with the hollow eyes of chronic illness. One boy young, very young, favoring his left side in a way that meant pain he had been ordered to ignore. A big man standing a little apart, hands like iron, watching her with a careful, measuring look. She looked back at Jed. He was unhitching the horse, his back to her. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked Gideon. He pointed. She walked toward it. Behind her, she heard one of the younger hands mutter something low, and another one snicker. She kept walking. She had been mocked before, by meaner people in worse moments. Mockery did not require a response. It only required that you keep moving, which she had always been able to do. The kitchen door opened, and she stepped inside. It smelled like old grease and something sour. The floor wanted sweeping. The shelves were in disorder. A pot sat on the cold stove with something dried and crusted at its bottom that she could not identify and did not try to. She set her carpet bag on the table. She looked around the room, at the walls that needed cleaning, the pantry that needed auditing, the window filmed with smoke. The disorder that accumulates when no one is paying attention to small things over a long period of time. Then she pushed her sleeves up to her elbows, opened the cold stove, and started building a fire. She had not come here to be welcomed. She had not come to be admired or approved of. She had not come because she had nowhere else to go, or, well, she had, but that was not the part that mattered. She had come to work, and in this kitchen, in this basin, On this cold Montana afternoon, with men outside, still laughing at her, and a husband who had insulted her in front of a crowd without blinking, she made the same quiet decision she had always made in every hard room she had ever walked into. She would not break. She never had. The mess hall was the worst room on the property. Evie discovered this on her first full morning at Ironwood Basin, when she pushed open the door at 5:30 and stood in the entrance long enough to take a full accounting of what she was looking at. Long pine table, seating for 20, covered in the grime of months, benches sticky with old spills. A shelf along one wall holding tin plates and cups that had not been properly washed in what looked like a considerable while. 2 lanterns, one window, filmed over with grease smoke and the smell, rancid fat, and something else beneath it, the low, persistent smell of food that had been bad before it was cooked. She went to the pantry. She stood there for a moment, with her arms folded, running her eyes over what was stored. Barrels of flour with the tops left loose, a slab of salt pork that had gone the wrong color, dried beans that looked fine, until you got close and found weevils working through the bottom of the sack, cornmeal that smelled off, a crate of canned goods with the labels half fallen away, rust creeping along the seams. This was what 15 men were eating. She carried a lantern back through the mess hall and out toward the bunkhouse while the sky was still gray and cold. She knocked twice and opened the door. The men were in various stages of waking, some already dressed, some sitting on their bunks pulling on boots. The boy, Toby. She had learned his name was Toby Finch, was already awake and sitting fully dressed on the edge of his mattress, which told her he had not been sleeping well. His face was pale beneath the dirt. He was 18 years old and looked like he was performing the act of being fine with everything he had. "Morning," Evie said. A few of them nodded. Most just looked at her. She looked at Toby. "When did you last have that leg properly seen to?" Silence. "It was dressed," one of the older hands said carefully. "A man named Holt, back in August. Trail boss said it was healing." "It isn't," Evie said. She crossed to Toby. He did not pull away, which told her he was tired of pretending it was fine. She knelt and pressed careful fingers along his shin through the worn denim. She could feel the heat from 3 feet away. The leg was inflamed from below the knee. When she found the spot, he went rigid but made no sound. "There's infection in there," she said. "The bone knit wrong and the wound closed over something it shouldn't have." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Can you ride?" "I ride every day," Toby said. "I'm not asking what you do. I'm asking if you can." His jaw moved. "It hurts some." She nodded. She stood up and looked around the room. At the hollow eyes, the men who were thin in a way that was not just Montana winter, the persistent coughs she had already counted among 3 different hands. "Who else is carrying something?" she asked. Nobody spoke. "I'm not asking to make a list," she said. "I'm asking because I need to know what we're working with. I have some medical knowledge. I am not a doctor, and I won't pretend to be. But I can help with some things, and I can't help if I don't know." Slowly, across the room, she collected a picture. Marcus Vance, the big blacksmith, had a deep cut on his left hand that had been wrapped in dirty cloth and left to deal with itself. One of the younger hands, named Pete, had been running a low fever for 2 weeks. Another man, weathered and quiet, named Abe, had a shoulder that had been dislocated at some point and set badly. She spent the next hour in that bunkhouse. She went back to the kitchen for her bag, which held the medical supplies she had packed in Ohio with exactly this kind of uncertainty in mind: clean cloth, carbolic solution, needle and thread, a small tin of drawing salve she had made herself from her mother's recipe. She cleaned Marcus's hand properly and dressed it. She sat with Pete and asked him questions until she was reasonably confident. The fever was exhaustion and bad food, rather than something worse. She told Abe she could not fix his shoulder, but that she knew an exercise that might ease the stiffness if he would let her show him. He let her, Toby. She saved for last, because Toby was the most serious. She cleaned the site, drew out what needed drawing with the salve, and redressed the wound with clean cloth tight enough to hold. It would need time. He needed to stay off it for at least a week. "Tell Mr. Coulter that," Toby said, with a flat humor that was not quite bitterness. "I will," Evie said. She meant it, literally. She found Jed in the yard at 7:30, crossing from the main house to the stable. He walked fast, the way a man walks when he has 17 things on his mind and zero patience for any of them. "Mr. Coulter." He stopped, turned, looked at her with the expression she was already beginning to recognize, guarded, impatient, already preparing for whatever inconvenience she was about to present. "Toby Finch needs to be off that leg for at least a week," she said. "The infection is serious. If it moves up into the knee, you'll lose him, or at minimum, lose the use of him, and that'll cost you more than a week of light duty." "He works," Jed said, "or he doesn't eat. That's the arrangement." Evie looked at him for a moment. She kept her voice level. "He's 18 years old. He's been riding on an infected leg since August because he's afraid of losing his place here. He works because he has no other choice. That's not the same thing as an arrangement. This ranch doesn't run on charity. This ranch won't run at all if you burn through men faster than you can replace them." She paused. "Toby can do useful work sitting down. He can mend tack, clean rifles, work the ledgers if he has any schooling. He doesn't have to be idle to be earning his place. He just can't be on a horse." Jed studied her. "You redressed his leg this morning." "I did, without asking me." "Would you have said yes?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and continued toward the stable. That was not a no. She had already learned to read the difference. She went back to the kitchen and started cooking. She cooked all morning. She sorted through the stores and threw out everything that was genuinely gone, and it was considerable, and built from what remained. She made a large pot of beef bone broth from a cut she found at the back of the cold box that was still good. She made corn porridge. She baked bread from the flour she sifted twice to make sure it was clean. She added dried herbs from her own bag, things her mother had taught her: sage for the lungs, clove for inflammation, rosemary for strength. At noon, she carried food out to the men in the field. They looked at her like she had arrived from somewhere slightly outside reality. Gideon Hayes rode over on his bay mare and looked at the pot she was carrying. "I didn't ask permission," she told him. "I can see that," he said. He looked at the pot, then at her. Something in his expression did not change exactly, but it shifted the way a very still pond shifts when a stone is dropped somewhere far off, just a ripple at the edge. "Smells better than what we had." "That isn't a high bar," she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite." That evening, all 15 men ate together in the mess hall for the first time in what Gideon later told her was several months. Evie served them herself, moving down the table with a ladle. She had set the table properly, or as properly as cracked tin plates and bent forks allowed. She had scrubbed the table that afternoon until the pine showed through. The men ate without talking much, which she took as a good sign. Hungry men talk when they're not hungry enough to eat first. Toby sat at the end of the bench with his leg elevated on a crate, eating with both hands, and the color in his face was already fractionally better. Marcus ate steadily and methodically, and when he finished, he looked across the table at her with a serious, considering expression. "Thank you," he said. His voice was deep and deliberate. "You're welcome," she said simply. Jed appeared in the mess hall doorway, just as the men were finishing. He looked at the table, at the men, at the empty pot. Evie was at the far end of the room, washing up. She straightened and turned to face him. She had been carrying this all day, and she was not going to carry it past nightfall. "You own thousands of head of cattle," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it, and she made no effort to hide that. "Yet, you treat these living, breathing men worse than a workhorse. They are human beings. They deserve care and basic respect. That is not charity. That is what you owe the people who hold this place together." The room went very quiet. Every man at the table was looking at the surface of the table, with profound concentration. Jed stood in the doorway. His expression did not shift in any way she could read clearly. His eyes moved once across the room, across the men, the clean table, Toby's elevated leg, the empty pot, and then came back to her. He said nothing. He left. Gideon caught her eye from across the table. He gave her one small, slow nod. Just one. She turned back to the washing up. Marcus Vance stayed to help her dry. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Working beside someone, doing the quiet labor together, that had always been its own kind of language. She understood it from years of tending her mother, with whoever happened to be present. You did not always need words, you needed hands. She was learning which men on this ranch had good hands. Marcus was one, Gideon was another. Toby would be once his leg healed, and Jed Coulter, she suspected. Though she could not yet prove it, Jed Coulter had the best hands of all. He just had not been using them for people in a very long time. She dried her own hands on a cloth and looked out the one clean window at the dark Montana sky. One day, she had been here one day. She went to bed exhausted and slept. The moment her head touched the pillow. The ranch office was a room off the main house that Jed appeared to use primarily as a place to put things he did not want to deal with. Evie found this out on her third morning at Ironwood Basin, when she knocked on the office door at 7 in the morning and got no answer and went in anyway. The desk was solid walnut, good quality, buried under 3 years of paperwork, ply receipts, payroll stubs, land correspondence, letters from the county office, none of it filed, all of it layered like geological strata, the oldest at the bottom, the most recent on top. She sat down and started reading. She was not a trained bookkeeper, but she had managed her father's debt for 4 years, and debt is a precise and unforgiving teacher. You learn to read numbers the way a Trail Scout reads ground, looking for the things that do not fit, the places where something should be and isn't. It took her 2 hours to find the first problem with Ezra Croft's supply invoices. It was a small thing. A barrel of cornmeal billed at $4 in the spring of 1881. The same barrel, same weight, same grade, billed at $3.20 in the autumn of that same year. Prices for staple goods do not rise in autumn. Autumn is harvest season. Prices come down. She kept reading. She found 9 more discrepancies over 3 years. Inflated prices on everything from salt pork to lamp oil to flour. The total gap between what the ranch had been paying and what fair market prices suggested worked out to just over $300. 3 years of quiet, steady theft from a man who was too buried in grief and day labor to look at his own books. She wrote the numbers in a clean column on a fresh sheet of paper and set it aside. Then she started. On the older files, she was looking for something specific, though she could not have named exactly what. The feeling had started the day before, when she was cleaning out the bottom desk drawer and found a roll of paper bound with old twine. She had unrolled it and found herself looking at a land survey map dated 1877 6 years ago. The survey lines were drawn in black ink, clean and precise, but in the area marked Northern Creek section, there was a shadow of older ink visible beneath the current lines. The kind of shadow that appears when someone has written over existing marks with a fresh pen not quite matching. She had set the map carefully aside and gone back to the ledgers. But it sat in her mind like a stone in a boot. She spread the map on the desk now and looked at it carefully in the morning light. The current boundary lines put the Northern Creek parcel, which she had already heard mentioned in connection with Sterling's interest in acquiring it approximately 50 yards south of where the older, underlying marks appeared to put it. It was a subtle shift, not something you would catch without looking for it. But 50 yards in the right direction could mean the difference between owning a water source and not owning one. Could mean the difference between land sitting above a mineral deposit and land sitting beside it. She was still looking at the map when she heard horses outside. She went to the window. There were 6 riders in the yard. 5 of them had the look of hired muscle, big men, sitting their horses with the relaxed confidence of people who carry guns and have used them. The 6th was different. He was broad and well-dressed in an expensive dark coat, sitting on a horse that cost more than most men in Montana Territory made in a year. He had silver at his temples and the smooth, self-certain face of a man who had not been told no in a considerable while. Thaddeus Sterling. She had heard the name once from Gideon, the day before, delivered with a careful flatness that told her everything she needed to know about the man without any additional elaboration. She put the survey map in the desk drawer, folded her numbers sheet, and put it in her apron pocket, and went out to the yard. Jed was already there, standing about 10 feet from Sterling's horse. His arms were at his sides. He looked calm in the way that very angry men sometimes look calm. Sterling was speaking when Evie came out. His voice was the kind that filled space on purpose. The Northern Creek parcel is sitting there doing you no good, Coulter. I'm offering fair value. More than fair. A man in your position would be wise to take cash money while it's being offered freely. It's not for sale, Jed said. Everything is for sale at the right number. Sterling let his eyes move across the yard, with deliberate leisure across the outbuildings, the men watching from a distance, and then to Evie, standing at the edge of the porch. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided something is beneath his regard and wants to make sure everyone around him knows it. That your mail-order girl? He made a small sound that was technically a laugh. Lord Coulter, you couldn't have found worse odds at a card table. The yard was very quiet. Evie stepped off the porch. She had been at the stove that morning. She had the cast-iron skillet in her right hand. She had carried it out without thinking about it, or perhaps with exactly the right amount of thinking about it. The handle was wrapped in cloth. The skillet itself was still hot from breakfast, a thin skin of rendered fat cooling on its surface. She walked to a spot between Jed and Sterling's horse. She looked up at Sterling. "Step off my husband's land," she said, clearly, "before I pour boiling lard down your throat." She held the skillet up slightly, so the morning light caught the iron surface. "We might be short on cash, but we aren't short on Winchester rifles or principles." Sterling looked at her for a moment. His polished expression did not crack, but it did something more interesting. It recalculated. The way a man's expression changes when he has assessed a situation as trivial and then encountered something in it he did not anticipate. He looked at Jed. Jed looked back at him without expression. Sterling pulled his horse around. His men followed without a word exchanged. They rode out of the yard at a controlled pace that was meant to communicate that he was leaving because he chose to, not because he had been made to. She watched until the last rider cleared the gate. Then she lowered the skillet. She became aware that Jed was looking at her. She turned. He was standing 5 feet away, and his expression was she could not fully name it. It was not the guarded impatience he had worn since the moment she stepped off the train. It was not warmth, exactly. It was more like the look of a man who has picked up a stone, expecting it to weigh one thing and found it weighs considerably more. He looked at her face, then at the skillet. Then, back at her face, he said nothing. He walked back toward the stable, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders. A fraction less closed. Like a door that has been locked a long time and has not yet been opened, but someone has turned the key. Gideon materialized at her elbow. He had that quality of appearing without making noise. "Sterling's been trying to get that parcel for 2 years," Gideon said quietly, looking toward the gate where the riders had disappeared. "Why that parcel specifically?" Evie asked. Gideon's jaw moved once. "Water rights, people say. Creek runs through it. People say," Evie repeated. "What do you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I say there are things under that ridge that aren't water." He glanced at her. "That's just what I say." She nodded slowly. That evening she asked Gideon carefully about the land survey, about whether the county records had ever been formally disputed, or whether there had been any boundary questions, around the time Hannah Coulter died. She watched him. His face did not do anything dramatic. It just went still, the way a man's face goes still when he realizes someone else has seen what he thought was hidden. "Where'd you find a survey map?" he asked. "Bottom of the desk drawer," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "You show that to Jed?" "Not yet. I want to understand it first." Gideon looked out across the yard. The evening sky was going deep purple and orange over the mountains, and the first cold of night was already moving down from the high country. He put his hands in his coat pockets. "Be careful," he said finally, not as a warning about danger, as something more like a prayer. "Be real careful with that." She told him she would be. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with the survey map and her column of numbers, and she let her mind work through what she had. $300 skimmed from the supply accounts, a land survey with something written over it. Sterling making an offer on the specific parcel that the old survey lines would indicate differently. Hannah Coulter, dying 6 years ago, the same year as the survey map's date. One thread does not make a pattern, but the thread is where you start. She sat there until the kitchen went dark around her, and then she lit the lamp and kept working. She had been trained by life rather than by school to follow numbers wherever they led. Numbers did not lie. People lied to the numbers. They altered them, inflated them, shifted them 50 yards south on a map, but the numbers themselves, if you read them carefully enough, always told the truth. Somewhere in this paperwork was the truth. She was going to find it. The herb garden was behind the main house, tucked against the south-facing wall, where it would catch the most winter light. Or it had been a garden once. Now it was a rectangle of frozen earth and dead stems, brown and collapsed. The whole thing choked, with 2 seasons of neglect. Evie found it on a Tuesday morning in late October, following a smell she recognized. Even dead, sage has a scent. Faint and dry, like something that remembers being alive. She crouched at the edge of the plot and pressed her fingers into the dirt. Frozen at the surface, but workable an inch below. The root systems were still there. She could tell by the way the stems broke dry at the top, still fibrous at the base. Sage is stubborn. Clove, too, she suspected, if she could locate where it had been planted. She went to find tools. She was an hour into clearing the dead growth when she heard the back door of the main house open hard against its frame. "Stop," Jed's voice. She had learned by now to gauge his moods by the weight of a single word. And this one was heavy. She straightened and turned. He was standing at the back door, coatless despite the cold, and his face had a look she had not seen on it before. Not anger exactly. Anger she could navigate. This was rawer than that. "That's Hannah's garden," he said. "I know," Evie said. "Then you know I didn't say you could touch it." She set the trowel down deliberately, not because she was backing down, but because she wanted her hands free to talk with. "You're right, you didn't, and I should have mentioned it to you before I started. That was my error." He was quiet, which was not the same as satisfied. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not digging this soil to erase Hannah," she said. "I'm doing it because these sage and clove plants can save Toby and Marcus this winter." She gestured at the dead stems in her hand. "Sage tea cuts through lung congestion. Clove draws infection. We're heading into the coldest months, and the nearest doctor is 40 miles off. What I can grow here is the difference between treating what ails these men and just watching them suffer through it." She paused. "Nursing a grudge isn't how you honor the dead. Honoring the dead means protecting the living." The words sat in the cold air between them. Jed's jaw was tight. His eyes moved to the garden, to the cleared section, to the roots she had uncovered, to the careful way she had sorted the dead material from what could be saved. His expression shifted through something she could not track and came out the other side at a different place. He did not say she could continue. He went back inside. She picked up the trowel and kept working. An hour later, she heard the back door again, quieter this time. She did not look up, but she heard him cross the yard, and after a moment, the sound of the woodpile, being split steady and hard, the way a man works when he is putting something somewhere. She worked until her hands ached from the cold. By the time she came inside, there was a stack of fresh-cut wood by the kitchen door, more than she could use in a week. She made no comment. He had made none either, but something had shifted, the same way it had shifted in the yard with Sterling. A fraction, an inch, like the slow movement of a door on a rusted hinge. She hung up her coat and started supper. The days that followed were the busiest of her life, and she had lived a busy life. She was up before dawn each morning, first to the kitchen to start the stove, then a round of the bunkhouse to check on Toby's leg and Pete's fever, then back to cook, then the ledgers when she could steal an hour, then the garden, then supper, then paperwork by lamplight until her eyes refused to stay open. Toby's leg was improving. She could see it clearly after a week. The heat was fading, the swelling coming down. He had taken to sitting at the mess hall table during the days and mending harness, which kept his hands busy and his weight off the leg. He had turned out to be good company, quiet but quick-minded, with a dry observation about ranch life that made her laugh unexpectedly more than once. Marcus she saw at the forge, most days, the sound of his hammer, a constant rhythm beneath everything else. He had the gift of economy. He did not waste motion, did not waste words, did not waste heat or iron. She had watched him work one afternoon and come away with a deep respect she did not quite have language for. He was simply masterful at his trade, and the fact that the wider territory chose not to see it was their impoverishment, not his. She asked him once, carefully, whether Sterling had ever approached him directly, whether the man had ever tried to use Marcus's marginal standing in the community as leverage. Marcus looked at the piece of iron he was working. Sterling uses everything he can reach, he said. That's his nature. A man like that doesn't see people. He sees what they might be useful for. And what did you tell him? Nothing worth repeating, Marcus said. He turned the iron in the coals. I work for Gideon and Mr. Coulter. That's where my word is. She nodded and left him to it. It was Gideon who first told her what she had suspected that word had gotten to Sterling about her interest in the old survey map. She could not prove how. Could have been Croft, who made deliveries to the ranch every 2 weeks and had eyes that moved too quickly around any room he entered. Could have been someone in town who overheard her asking questions at the county records office on the one trip she had made to Oak Haven for supplies. He knows you've been looking at the deed records, Gideon told her one evening, low, while the hands were finishing supper, and the noise level covered their conversation. I can't say how I know that, but I know. Evie absorbed this. What do you think he'll do? Gideon's expression was the expression of a man who has seen certain things before and has opinions about what comes next. A man with that much to protect doesn't ask politely twice. He looked at her directly. Whatever evidence you've gathered, it needs to be somewhere he can't reach it. She had already made copies. 2 sets, one in the desk. One she had sewn into the lining of her carpet bag the previous evening, working by lamplight with small, careful stitches, the same way she had once sewn her mother's remaining jewelry into a coat hem to keep it from her father's hands during a bad stretch. Preservation by concealment. It was a skill she had not expected to need again. She did not tell Gideon this. She just nodded and said she would be careful. It was the 3rd week of November when the snowstorm came. It built for 2 days before it hit, the sky going that particular yellow-gray that Gideon read like a clock. He pulled 3 hands off fence work and sent them to check the far pastures. Jed went with them. They were back before dark, or they were supposed to be. By 8 o'clock that evening, 4 of them were back. Jed was not among them. Evie was in the kitchen. She kept working, kept the stove high and a pot of broth hot. Toby was at the table, awake and saying nothing, which was its own kind of worry made audible. The wind outside was extraordinary, not howling but screaming, a sound the mountains made when they meant it. At 9:30, they heard the horse. Jed came through the front door at a near stagger, bringing cold in with him like a physical thing. He was covered in snow from the waist down, soaked through his coat from a creek crossing, and there was blood on his right hand, from where something barbed wire, she guessed, from the look of it, had opened 3 parallel cuts across his palm and knuckles. "Strays?" Gideon asked. 16 head, north pasture. Jed's voice was rougher than usual, scraped raw by cold. Mira's colt, too. Got them into the lower barn. He stood in the hallway, dripping snowmelt on the floor, and looking like he might stay vertical through sheer stubbornness, and not much else. "Sit down," Evie said from the kitchen doorway. Not a suggestion. He looked at her. "Your hand needs cleaning," she said. "Sit down." He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. Toby, reading the room, quietly got up on his good leg and took himself somewhere else. Evie brought the lamp close. She unwrapped his hand. He had tied a piece of cloth around it himself hastily, the knot already stiff with cold and blood. She got a basin of warm water and cleaned the cuts methodically. The barbed wire had done a clean job of it, 3 lines precise as a pen stroke, deep enough to matter, not deep enough to need stitching if she dressed it correctly. She worked without speaking. The kitchen was warm, and the wind outside was trying very hard to be indoors, and the lamp cast everything in yellow light. She could feel him watching her work. "You're fast," he said finally. "I've done this a lot," she said. "On a ranch?" "On my father," she said. "He had a particular talent for injuring himself. I had a particular responsibility for fixing it." She wrapped his hand in clean cloth, firm but not tight. "Hold that." He held it while she tied it off. She had not moved back yet. She was still close, the lamp between them, and she looked up to check the dressing, and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face at all before. Not guarded, not impatient, not recalculating, just present, like a man who has been somewhere far away and has arrived back in the room. "My first wife," he said. Stopped, started again. "Hannah, she died in the winter." His voice was careful with the name. Fever took her fast. February of 77. There wasn't anything that could have been done. Doc said so, and I believe him, but I was out working when it started. His eyes were steady. I was always out working. Evie was very still. I thought keeping this place going was the same as taking care of what mattered, he said. I was wrong about that. I didn't know I was wrong until it was too late to do anything with knowing it. She looked at his bandaged hand and then at his face. "You weren't wrong to work," she said. "You were wrong to think work was enough on its own. That's a different thing. And it's a thing a lot of men get taught too late." She paused. "Hannah's garden is going to have sage in it by spring. I want you to know I'll tend it properly." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you will," he said. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the house. Inside, the stove clicked and breathed. He went to bed an hour later, at her insistence, and she sat at the kitchen table after he was gone and looked at the lamp and let herself feel the weight of the evening settling. This was a complicated man. Grief had closed him like a fist closing, and it had been closed for 6 years, and she did not know yet whether it would open. But tonight, sitting in this kitchen with his cut hand in the lamplight, she had seen what was behind the closed fist. It was not nothing. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. What she did not know yet, what none of them at Ironwood Basin knew yet, was that 20 miles south, in a warm office in Oakhaven, Thaddeus Sterling had already decided he had been patient long enough. He had heard about the survey map. He had heard about the ledger work. He understood, with the precise calculation of a man who has covered his tracks once and does not intend to have them uncovered, exactly what it meant, that this plain-faced woman from Ohio was sitting in Jed Coulter's office going through old files by lamplight. He called his men in. He told them what he wanted. He told them to wait until the storm passed. The storm broke on a Thursday and left the world white and still and brutally cold. By Friday, the ranch was back to full work rhythm, horses fed, cattle checked, fences assessed for storm damage, the lower barn cleared of the strays Jed had hauled in. Life at Ironwood Basin had a quality she had come to appreciate. It recovered fast. Men who lived close to hard things did not require long periods of adjustment. Storm was over. The work remained. You got on with it. Toby was walking with only a slight limp now. She watched him cross the yard on Friday morning without favoring the leg much at all, and let herself feel briefly satisfied. Satisfaction was something she rationed. You did not let yourself feel it too long or too completely, because the next thing was always waiting. But a moment of it, a breath's worth, that seemed allowable. She was in the office that afternoon when Marcus knocked on the doorframe. "Rider coming in," he said. From the South Road. She went to the window. It was a lone rider, coming at a moderate pace, nobody she recognized. He stopped at the yard gate, spoke briefly to one of the hands, and rode on. She thought nothing more of it. That was her error, though she would not know it until much later. Sterling's hired guns did not arrive all at once and announce themselves. They came separately over the course of the afternoon, some from the south, some cutting across through the timber to the east, settling into the dark places outside the ranch perimeter like men who understood that patience is a weapon. None of them were visible from the house by dark. Supper that evening was louder than usual. Gideon had told a story from his cavalry years that had the younger hands laughing, and Marcus had produced a harmonica from somewhere and played 3 songs after the plates were cleared. Toby had a color in his face she had not seen when she arrived. Evie sat at the end of the table and drank her coffee and watched these 15 men and allowed herself to think, privately and carefully, that this place was beginning to feel like something it probably had not felt like in 6 years, like a home. Jed sat across the table from her, and twice during the evening she looked up and found him watching her. He did not look away quickly when she caught him. He just looked back, and after a moment the corner of his mouth moved in something that stopped just short of a smile, but was clearly its first cousin. She went to bed at 9 o'clock. She woke at 11:53, with the smell of smoke, not wood smoke, not the clean, cold pine smoke of the stoves. This was something heavier and darker, hay and old timber, the smell of things that were not meant to burn. She was at her window before she was fully awake. The barn was on fire. The flames were already through the roof on the west end, punching orange light into the black sky, and as she watched, a second fire started at the far corner, which told her in one cold instant that this was not an accident. Accidents start in one place. This started in 2. She was dressed and out of her room in less than a minute. The yard erupted. Men came boiling out of the bunkhouse, most half-dressed, all of them running toward the barn, and then the first shot cracked from somewhere in the dark to the east. And everything changed. One of the hands went down, not hit, she realized, diving for cover, and then more shots came from 2 directions, and the yard became a chaos of shouting and running, and the terrible screaming of horses still inside the barn. Gideon's voice cut through everything, trained and commanding. "Cover right. 2 men on the water line, the rest of you get those horses out." He had not done this before. She could hear it in his voice. A man who has commanded men under fire sounds different from a man pretending to. The hands responded to him, the way men respond to the real thing. And within 60 seconds there was a rough defensive line formed at the fence, and Toby and 2 others were running toward the barn doors. She was looking for Jed. She found him coming out of the main house with a rifle, moving toward the yard, and she was moving toward him when the shot came from behind the water trough. She heard it more than saw it a crack, and then Jed lurched sideways and went down in the dirt. "Jed!" She ran. He was conscious. Barely. He had his hand pressed to his right side, below the ribs, and there was blood coming fast between his fingers. She got under his arm, and he got one knee under himself. And between them, they got him moving, and Toby, who appeared from nowhere, with the velocity of a boy, who has been waiting his whole short life for a moment that required him, took Jed's other arm. They got him to the stone kitchen. The stone kitchen was the oldest part of the house, built from the mountain itself, and it was the right place to be. The timber walls would burn, the stone would not. Gideon was already shouting this to the men, pulling the defensive line back toward the house, using the stone structure as their anchor. Evie got Jed onto the long pine dining table. She cut his shirt open. The bullet had gone in below the floating rib on the right side. She pressed both hands against the wound, hard, and Jed's breath came in a sharp hiss. His face was the color of old ash, but his eyes were open, and they were on her face. "Stay with me," she said, quietly, clearly. "Look at me and stay here." "I'm here," he said, his voice thin. From outside came the continuous sound of gunfire, not constant, but regular, the exchange of men who are positioned and holding. Glass broke somewhere in the main house. The horses that had been freed from the barn were thundering somewhere in the dark. The barn itself was a column of fire now, lighting the whole ranch in shaking orange, and through the kitchen's one small window she could see figures moving at the perimeter. Gideon got the kitchen door open and put his head in. His face was black with soot, and his hat was gone. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough," Evie said. "He needs surgery." Gideon looked at her for a full second. "Can you?" "I can try," she said. "I need light, and I need everyone who isn't shooting to be quiet." He nodded and pulled the door shut. Toby was already moving, lighting every lamp in the kitchen, positioning them around the table without being asked. She looked at him, and he looked back at her with a face that had gone past fear into something cleaner, pure focus, the expression of a person who has committed to what needs to be done. "You'll help me," she told him. "Whatever I ask you to do, you do it." "Yes, ma'am," Toby said. She scrubbed her hands. She laid out what she had: her medical bag, the carbolic solution, the sharpest knife in the kitchen, which was hers, and which she kept in a case in her bag for this exact category of necessity. She had not truly believed she would need it this soon. She had hoped. Jed looked at the knife. "Evie, don't," she said. "I just want to say." "You can say it when it's done," she said. "Right now, I need you to hold still and trust me." He was quiet. He looked at the ceiling. She could see him making the decision. She was asking him to make setting aside everything that fear does to a person and choosing deliberately to be still. She worked. Outside, the fire roared, and the guns answered each other across the frozen ground. The roof of the mess hall caught at some point. She heard it, a sound like a great exhale, and she did not look up. She kept her hands where they needed to be, and her eyes on what was in front of her. And she worked by the light of 7 lamps, while Toby held what she asked him to hold, and passed her what she asked him to pass. Somewhere past midnight, Gideon's voice rose above everything else outside, a battle command from a man who had learned how to issue them in the worst years of the last generation, and there was a sound of movement, a thundering of boots, and the gunfire shifted direction. Then it diminished. Then it stopped. The silence after prolonged gunfire is a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful, more like the world catching its breath. Evie did not stop. She had not reached the stopping point yet. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she finally pressed clean cloth tight against the wound and tied the dressing and straightened up and let herself breathe. Her hands were dark with blood and soot. Her back ached from bending. The lamps were burning low. Jed was unconscious. His breathing was shallow, but it was regular. And regular was what she had been working toward for the last 2 hours. She sat down on the floor next to the table, her back against the cabinet, her knees drawn up. Toby slid down the wall on the other side of the room and sat the same way. And they were quiet together for a long moment. Then from outside came the sound of boots on the porch, and the kitchen door opened. And Sterling's lead man, a wide, hard-faced figure she had seen twice in Sterling's company, and never learned the name of, stood in the doorway with 2 armed men behind him. The yard beyond him was smoking and quiet. The barn was a skeleton of embers. He looked at Jed on the table, at Evie on the floor. He raised his voice over the wind, hand over the land deeds and the woman. "Or we burn you all alive before sunrise." Evie looked up at him from the floor. Her back was against the cabinet. Her hands were covered in the blood of the man she had just spent 2 hours keeping alive. The lamps were guttering, and the kitchen smelled of carbolic and soot and gun smoke. And outside the Montana sky was as black and cold as anything she had ever known. She had a surgical knife in her hand. Her eyes met his through the rising smoke. She did not blink. The man in the doorway had a voice built for intimidation. Loud, certain, the kind of voice that expected walls to move when it spoke. Evie did not move. She sat on the kitchen floor, with her back against the cabinet, and the surgical knife in her blood-darkened hand, and she looked at him with eyes that had not slept in 20 hours, and had spent 2 of those hours doing things she would not soon forget. She was past fear. Fear requires energy, and she had spent all of hers on something more important. "Hand over the land deeds and the woman," he said again, "or we burn you all alive before sunrise." Toby, across the room, had gone absolutely still against the wall. His eyes were on Evie, waiting. She looked at the man in the doorway, at the 2 behind him, at the smoking yard visible past his shoulder. "You've already burned the barn," she said. Her voice was steady. "You shot my husband. You spent the better part of 3 hours trying to drive 15 men off their own land." She stood up from the floor slowly, deliberately, with the particular dignity of someone who refuses to be found sitting down. "And you didn't manage any of it. So before you make another threat, I'd think carefully about whether you still have enough men standing to carry it out." The man's eyes moved past her to Jed on the table, assessing. "He's alive," she said, "and he'll stay that way." From somewhere outside, to the left-east of the house, past the ruined barn, there was a sudden eruption of sound. Not gunfire. Something heavier, glass breaking, men shouting, a tremendous crash that rang across the yard like a bell. The lead man's head turned sharply. That was when Gideon moved. She heard him before she saw him. His voice came from the dark outside the doorway, positioned somewhere the lamplight did not reach low, commanding, the voice of a man who has flanked an enemy position before and knows exactly when to announce himself. "Drop them." 2 more of his voice, from different angles, the hands positioned in the dark. The man in the doorway did the calculation that men in doorways do when they realize the variables have changed. He looked into the kitchen at Evie, at Jed on the table, at Toby against the wall. He looked behind him at his 2 men. He looked into the dark where Gideon's voice had come from. He lowered his gun. The other 2 followed. What had happened, she pieced it together over the following hour, was this: Gideon had spent the early part of the standoff appearing to organize a defensive line at the front of the house, which was real enough, while quietly pulling Marcus and 2 of the steadier hands around the east side through the dark and the smoke. The smoke bombs he had made from grease jars and wet cloth were, as Gideon described it later, with characteristic understatement, effective at causing confusion in the short term. They had come up behind Sterling's remaining men, while the lead man was at the kitchen door, and the crash Evie had heard was Marcus taking the better part of a section of fence into the back of a man who had not been paying sufficient attention to his surroundings. The ambushers became the ambushed. It was not elegant, but it worked. Sterling's men were disarmed, bound, and put in what remained of the stone storage room. Someone rode for town at Gideon's order before the gunsmoke had fully cleared. The sheriff of Oakhaven and a federal deputy arrived by first light. But that was later. In the immediate aftermath, as the remaining fire was beaten down with dirt and snow, and everything quieted to the sound of wind and distant embers, the hands came back to the kitchen, one by one, some bleeding, all exhausted, all alive. They came through the kitchen door in 1s and 2s and stood there in the lamplight, looking at Jed on the table breathing, bandaged, pale but present, and then at Evie standing beside him. She had not moved from his side since she finished. Her apron was ruined. Her hair had come completely undone and fell loose around her shoulders. She was still holding a cloth pressed to his side with one hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. Gideon came in last. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the lamps burning low, at the battered men, at Toby, still against the wall with dried blood on his hands from helping. at Evie. He took his Stetson off. He held it in both hands, and he turned to face the men. All 15 of them crowded into that stone kitchen that smelled of carbolic and smoke and iron. Last night, he said, she didn't run. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. She bled and fought to keep our boss breathing. If any man in this territory ever calls her an outsider or mocks her again, he paused, and his eyes moved across every face in the room. One at a time, slowly he'll answer to every Winchester on Ironwood Basin. Another pause. From this dawn on, she is family. The cheer that went up from those 15 men in that stone kitchen was not a polished thing. It was rough and cracked and exhausted. The cheer of people who have been through something together and are still standing. Some of them whooped. Marcus put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. Pete, feverish and swaying on his feet, clapped until Gideon made him sit down. Toby, from his wall, just looked at her with his young face open and his eyes bright. Evie stood at the table beside her husband and let it hit her. She had not cried since Ohio. She had not let herself. There had been too much to do and too little time, and the kind of grief she had been carrying did not leave room for tears. It left room only for forward motion. One foot and then the other. Keep moving, keep working, don't stop, because stopping is where it gets you. But this was different. This was not grief. This was the opposite of grief, and she had no practice with it. The tears came quietly. She did not try to hide them. She stood straight and let them come. And after a moment, Marcus, who was closest, turned and looked away respectfully and busied himself checking the lamps, which gave her something like privacy, without requiring anyone to make a fuss of it. That was a graceful thing to do. She noticed it. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and took a breath. Jed stirred on the table. She was beside him immediately, her hand on his arm. His eyes opened slowly, with visible effort, blinking against the lamplight. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. His face was still the color of old ash, but his eyes were focused. "Present, you're in the kitchen," she said quietly. "You're going to be all right." He looked at her for a moment, at her face, her undone hair, her ruined apron. His eyes moved to the room beyond her, to the men, the smoke still threading in from somewhere, the lamps. "The barn," he said. "Gone," she said. The house held. He absorbed this. "The horses?" "Most of them. We'll know better when it's light." He exhaled slowly. His right hand moved, seeking something, and she put her hand in his without thinking about it. His fingers were cold. She wrapped both her hands around his one and held on. He did not say anything. She did not say anything either. The dawn came up over the Montana mountains, the way dawn comes up after bad nights, slowly, with some hesitation, as if checking first whether it was still wanted. The sky went from black to the deep blue-gray that precedes everything, and then the first thin line of gold showed over the eastern ridgeline, and the snow-covered valley caught it and threw it back up, and Ironwood Basin was suddenly, briefly, luminous. Evie was sitting in the chair pulled to Jed's bedside. They had moved him properly to bed once Gideon declared the yard safe, and she was asleep, with her head on her folded arms on the edge of the mattress when the first light came through the window. She did not know she had fallen asleep. One moment she was watching his breathing, and then she was not watching anything. She was still there when he woke. He watched her sleep for a while before he said anything. She was bent forward in the chair, her cheek resting on her arms, her hair spread loose across the blanket near his hand. Her breathing was deep, and even the sleep of someone who has nothing left to defer to. Outside the window, the morning was white and cold and new. His side ached with a dull, persistent authority. She had told him the bullet had been close to the rib, but had not struck bone. He believed her. He had taken a shot before, years ago, and he knew the difference between what bone damage felt like and what this felt like. This was survivable. He knew it the way you know the ground when you finally find it after a bad fall. He looked at her and let himself do it without turning away. 3 weeks. She had been on this ranch for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she had fed his men properly for the first time in years, treated Toby's leg, Stared down, Thaddeus Sterling with a cast iron skillet, found the discrepancies in 3 years of supply invoices, identified something wrong with an old land survey, and spent 2 hours with her hands inside his side in a smoke-filled kitchen, keeping him alive. He had brought her here because he needed someone to manage a household and share a practical arrangement. He had been cold to her on the platform. He had made her feel, on her very first hour in Montana, that she was insufficient, that she had fallen short of a requirement. He thought about that now, lying in the morning light with his side bandaged and her asleep beside him. He had been wrong, not just about her, about the entire arithmetic of the thing, the way he had been calculating people as functions rather than as persons, the way he had run this ranch since Hannah died, treating everything living on it as a mechanism to be maintained rather than a being to be considered. Evie had said it plainly in the mess hall that first week. They are human beings. They deserve care and basic respect. He had been furious at the time, not because she was wrong, because she was right, and he had not wanted to hear it said out loud in front of 15 men who already knew it. She stirred, her eyes opened, unfocused for a moment, and then she found him and sat up fast. "You should have woken me," she said. "You needed sleep." "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot," he said, which is accurate. She was already reaching for his wrist, checking his pulse with 2 fingers, and the expression she wore when she was counting. He let her. After a moment, she seemed satisfied and settled back. "Fever is down from last night," she said. "That's good, Evie." She was straightening the blanket, and she stopped. He looked at her directly. "Thank you." She met his eyes. She did not say, "of course," or anyone would have, or any of the other things people say when they want to diminish what they did. She just looked at him for a moment and said, "You're welcome, Jed." It was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of Mr. Coulter, and he did not think she was aware she had done it, which made it mean more. He healed slowly, and she managed it with efficiency. She did not fuss. She did not hover in a way that made him feel like an invalid. She came twice a day, checked the wound, changed the dressing, asked him questions that were medically necessary, and listened to the answers. She brought food and sat at the small table near the window while he ate, and they talked about the ranch, about the men, about what had to be rebuilt after the fire. Practical things. The kind of conversations that accumulate over time into something that looks like a life built together. On the 4th day, Toby brought up the scorched documents. He knocked on the bedroom door that afternoon while Evie was changing the dressing, and he came in holding a leather document case that was blackened at the edges but had survived. He had found it in the rubble of the mess hall, he explained. It had been under the floorboards behind the pantry, which was where Evie had stored it after making her copies. "Thought you'd want these," Toby said. He set the case on the small table and left. She looked at Jed. He looked at the case. "We need to talk about the survey map," she said. She laid everything on the bed beside him, the copies she had made, which had been in her carpet bag and were untouched, and what remained of the original documents. She showed him the supply ledgers first, the $300 in inflated invoices over 3 years, methodically documented, line by line. He looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. "Croft?" he said. "Yes." "I should have looked at the books myself." "You were managing grief," she said. "That's not an excuse, but it's an explanation." Croft knew what he was doing. He timed his arrangement to start right after Hannah died. He was counting on you not looking. Jed's jaw was tight. "What else?" She spread the survey map. She had marked the discrepancy, clearly a thin line in pencil, showing where the original ink marks appeared to sit beneath the overwritten lines and the 50-yard difference that resulted. She had also, on a separate sheet, drawn a rough diagram of the Northern Creek parcel as the original survey would have indicated it and as the current county records showed it. She set both in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. She watched his face as he worked through it, the crease between his brows, the slow, precise way his eyes moved over the lines, The same way she had seen him look at a problem with the cattle patient, thorough, not jumping to conclusions, but not shying away from them either. The spring, he said. Yes, if the original lines are correct, the underground spring falls inside Ironwood Basin, not on the parcel Sterling wants. That's what I believe, she said. And the ridge. Silver ore, Gideon thinks. He didn't say how he knows, but he said it with some certainty. Jed sat back against the headboard. His face had gone through several things in the last 60 seconds, and had arrived somewhere cold and clear. This was done in 1877. The survey is dated 1877, Evie said. February, he looked at her. She could see him making the connection. February 1877. Hannah had died in February 1877. Sterling, he said. He went to the county He stopped. While you were making arrangements for Hannah, Evie said. While you were not in a position to be paying attention to land records. The room was very quiet. She waited. She had learned that Jed Coulter processed hard information by going still, and that the stillness was not emptiness, it was the opposite. It was a man putting something large and heavy into its proper place, doing it carefully so it would not damage anything else on the way down. Croft, he said finally. The supply scam, the mail-order arrangement. He sent for a mail-order bride. I believe he placed the advertisement himself, Evie said. Or as Sterling did through him. A woman brought in from outside someone who knew nothing about the ranch, the land, the history, someone who could theoretically be managed or intimidated. She paused. I don't think they counted on the particular woman who answered the advertisement. Something moved across his face then. It was brief, and she almost missed it. No, he said. I don't imagine they did. He looked at her for a moment, at her steady brown eyes, her capable hands folded in her lap, the posture she always held, straight and unhurried. 3 weeks ago, he had stood on a train platform and called her a starved bird in front of a crowd. He had been wrong about her in every possible direction. I was cruel to you, he said, on the platform. She looked at him with an expression that was neither forgiveness performance nor lingering resentment. Just acknowledgement. You were? I was wrong. You were? She said again. But you've been less wrong every day since. I find that more interesting than the first impression. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, and she did not pull it back. And the afternoon light moved slowly across the bedroom floor, while they sat together with the evidence of 6 years of deception spread between them and the knowledge of what came next, settling into shape. Helena, he said. The territorial court, she said. We need the original deed records. If they haven't been altered there too, if Sterling only had reach as far as the county office, then the original 1877 territorial deed will show the true boundary lines. When can I travel? 2 weeks, she said firmly. 10 days, she said, and you'll ride in the wagon, not on horseback. He looked like he wanted to argue about this. He looked at her face. He did not argue. 10 days, he said. She stood to go, and he held her hand a moment longer. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. There was a great deal in that moment that neither of them put into words, partly because neither of them was built for the flowery version of things, and partly because some things are spoken more honestly by the fact of a held hand than by any sentence either person could construct. She gave his hand one brief pressure, and then she left. He lay back and looked at the ceiling, with the survey map beside him, and for the first time in 6 years, for the first time since a February morning in 1877. When everything had changed in the span of a few terrible hours, Jedediah Coulter did not feel like a man carrying his life alone. He felt like a man with a partner. He was careful with the feeling. He did not want to break it by handling it wrong. But he held it. Quietly, deliberately. He held it the way you hold something you have been without for a long time and intend to keep. The wagon rolled out of Ironwood Basin on a cold, bright morning 10 days after the fire, exactly as Evie had insisted. Jed sat beside her on the bench seat, with a folded blanket over his knees, which he had accepted only after she told him plainly that arguing about it would not make the wound close any faster. Gideon rode ahead. Marcus and Toby followed behind in a second wagon, loaded with what documents they had, wrapped tight in oilcloth against the weather. 5 days to Helena. 5 days of frozen roads and small towns and hard beds and coach, stops that smelled of tallow and wet wool. Evie did not mind the discomfort. She had crossed half the country once already on a train seat with nothing but bread and her own resolve. This felt almost easy by comparison, mostly because this time she was not traveling toward a stranger. She was traveling beside a man who reached for her hand. Without thinking about it now, the way you reach for something that has already become familiar. They reached Helena on the 5th evening, tired and travel-worn, and pulled up outside the Continental, the finest hotel in the territorial capital, its windows glowing gold against the dark street. The clerk behind the desk was a thin man with a waxed mustache and an expression that soured the moment Marcus stepped through the door behind Jed. "We don't have rooms for his kind," the clerk said, not quietly. Several guests in the lobby turned to look. "Nor for the boy," he added, glancing at Toby's cane with open distaste. Jed's jaw went hard. "These men rode 5 days with me. They'll have rooms, same as anybody." "House policy," the clerk said, unmoved. Evie stepped forward before Jed could say anything sharper. She set her gloved hands flat on the polished desk and looked the clerk directly in the eye. "At Ironwood Basin," she said, her voice carrying clean across the lobby, "men who bleed and sweat together sit at the same table. A hotel that disrespects the dignity of our men doesn't deserve a single cent of our money." The lobby had gone quiet enough to hear the fire crackling in the hearth. "Come on," she said, turning to the others. "There's a diner 2 streets down that'll feed working men without asking what color their hands are." They walked out together, all 5 of them, past a lobby full of silk dresses and startled faces. Nobody said a word until they reached the diner, a low, warm place with sawdust on the floor, and a cook who took one look at Toby's leg and pulled out a chair for him without being asked. Marcus ate slowly that night, the way he always did, but Evie noticed something different in his face. Not gratitude exactly, something steadier than that. "You didn't have to do that," he told her once the plates were cleared. "I know," Evie said. "I wanted to. Most people don't want to." "Then most people are wrong," she said simply, and went back to her coffee. The next morning they went to the territorial court. The clerk of records was a tired, careful man named Whitfield, who had worked in that office for 11 years and had seen every kind of claim come through his window. Evie laid out her documents in order, the way she had learned to lay out a ledger, so that a man's eye would follow the numbers exactly where she wanted them to go. The altered county survey, the supply invoices, the pencil marking, showing the 50-yard discrepancy. "I need the original 1,877 territorial deed for the Ironwood Basin land grant," she said. "Not the county copy, the federal one." Whitfield disappeared into the archive room for the better part of an hour. When he came back, he was carrying a leather folder tied with faded ribbon, and his expression had changed. "This survey was never amended at the territorial level," he said, laying the deed flat on the counter. "Whoever altered the county record didn't have the authority to touch the federal filing." This he tapped the original boundary lines, drawn in ink that had gone brown with age, but had never been touched since. "This is the true line. Your husband's land includes the spring and the ridge." Jed looked at the old deed for a long moment. Evie watched his face and saw something settle there that had been unsettled for 6 years. "6 years," he said quietly. "6 years I thought I'd lost that water for good reason. Legal reason." "There was no legal reason," Whitfield said. "There was only a man with enough money to make a county clerk look the other way." Evie folded her hands. "We'll need a certified copy," she said. "And I'll need your testimony if it comes to that." "It'll come to that." Whitfield said. A thing like this always does. That evening, back at the diner, Gideon leaned back in his chair and looked at Evie with something close to open admiration. You did in one day what I couldn't have done in a year of asking around, he said. I didn't do anything, but read what was already there, Evie said. That's the whole trick of it, Gideon said. Most folks don't bother to read. Jed reached over and took her hand under the table, where nobody but her could feel it, and held it there through the rest of supper without saying anything at all. Some things needed no words. She had learned that from him, same as he had learned patience and mercy from her, and it seemed to her a fair trade, one that neither of them had expected when they started, and both of them were grateful for now. Oakhaven Town Hall filled up an hour before the hearing was set to begin. Word had gotten around fast, the way it always did in a territory where news traveled by saddle and gossip traveled faster. Ranchers came in from every direction. Some Evie recognized from her one trip into town for supplies. Most she did not. Townsfolk crowded the back benches. Sterling's men stood near the door, in a loose knot, arms crossed, doing nothing to hide the fact that they were armed. Sterling himself sat at the front, with Ezra Croft beside him, both of them dressed like men who had never once doubted the outcome of anything in their lives. The circuit judge called the hearing to order, and Sterling's lawyer rose first. Your Honor, he began, this claim rests on the word of a woman with no legal training, presenting documents of questionable provenance on behalf of a man who has, by his own admission, struggled with his faculties since the tragic loss of his first wife. We would ask the court to consider whether Mr. Coulter is of sound enough mind to be pursuing a claim of this magnitude at all. A murmur went through the room. Jed's hand tightened on the table in front of him. But he said nothing, which Evie understood, cost him considerably more than speaking would have. Your Honor, Evie said, rising, if my husband's mind were unsound, I doubt he could have rebuilt a barn, managed 15 men through a Montana winter, and ridden 5 days to Helena without complaint. Grief is not madness. It is simply grief. I'd ask that the court not confuse the two. The judge's mouth twitched, something close to approval, though he said nothing. Evie walked to the front of the room and laid out what she had. The territorial deed first, its old ink plain and unaltered. Then the county survey, with the overwritten lines she had traced in pencil. So the discrepancy was impossible to miss, even from the back row. Then the ledgers, 3 years of inflated invoices documented line by line in her own careful hand, alongside Croft's original receipts. Mr. Sterling altered the county survey 6 years ago, she said. In the same month, my husband's first wife died, when he knew Mr. Coulter would not be looking. Mr. Croft has been skimming this ranch's supply accounts ever since, selling spoiled goods to men who could not afford to complain. Together they have taken water, land, and dignity from 15 working men for 6 years, and they nearly burned that ranch to the ground, rather than let this come to light. Sterling rose, his composure cracking for the first time Evie had seen. This is absurd. A woman reading tea leaves in old paperwork. The territorial court's own clerk of records confirmed the discrepancy. Evie said, cutting him off, calm as still water. You may ask Mr. Whitfield yourself. He rode 2 days to be here. Whitfield stood from the third row and gave a short, clear nod toward the judge. Sterling's face went the color of old ash. That was when his men near the door made their move. It happened fast. One of them reached for his sidearm, and the room seemed to inhale all at once. And then the double doors at the back banged open, and 15 ironwood cowboys walked in, rifles already up, forming a line in front of Evie and Jed. So clean and so sudden it looked rehearsed, though it was not. Gideon stood at the center of them, his old cavalry bearing plain in every line of his shoulders. Behind him, small ranchers Evie had spoken with over the past week stepped forward too, adding their own rifles to the wall, until there were nearly 30 guns leveled steady across that room. Nobody in this territory is burning anything else down today, Gideon said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Sterling's man lowered his gun, then another, then all of them. The back doors opened again, and a territorial U.S. Marshal walked through, unhurried, a folded paper in his hand. "That is Sterling," he said. "Ezra Croft. I have warrants here for fraud, forgery, and attempted murder. You'll come with me now, gentlemen, or you'll come with me after these good people finish shooting, and I expect you'd rather it be the first way." Nobody in the room laughed, but several people wanted to. Sterling was led out in silence, his fine coat suddenly looking like something borrowed rather than owned. Croft went quieter still, his eyes on the floor the whole way. The room came apart into noise then, ranchers shaking hands, townsfolk talking over each other, the whole hall filling with the particular relief of people who had watched something wrong get set right in front of their own eyes. Jed stood slowly, favoring his side, and looked at the wall of his own men, still standing in front of him, rifles lowering now, faces turning back toward him with something that looked a great deal like pride. "Every man of you," he said, his voice rough, "rode 2 days for this." "Wasn't a question of riding," Gideon said. "Wasn't a question at all." Evie looked at her husband, and at the 15 men who had become, in the space of a few short months, something closer to family than any arrangement on paper could account for. And she found she did not need to say anything either. The wall of rifles said it plainly enough. So did the silence after. Spring came to Ironwood Basin the way it always came to that country, all at once, and completely, as though the land had simply been waiting for permission. The valley greened up fast once the snow pulled back. Wildflowers came in along the creek banks. The new barn stood finished and square where the old one had burned, built through the winter by men who had, for the first time in years, been paid a fair wage for it. The spring itself ran clear and full down from the ridge, restored to Ironwood Basin by federal decree, and the silver seam beneath the northern rock was already being surveyed properly, this time by men who could be trusted to read a map honestly. Jed had changed the way the ranch was run, and he had not done it quietly. Every hand now drew a fair wage, set and posted, with no room for a foreman's favor or a bad month to shrink it. A small medical fund had been started, paid into by the ranch itself, so that no man would ever again ride an infected leg because the alternative was going hungry. Toby had been sent that spring to apprentice under a saddler in Helena who owed Jed a favor, and did not know yet how much he was about to gain from the arrangement. "You don't have to do this," Toby told Evie the morning he left, standing by the wagon with his bag over one shoulder, his leg fully healed, and his stride, even for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. "I know," Evie said. "I wanted to." He hugged her, quick and a little embarrassed by it, the way young men do, and then he climbed up beside the driver and did not look back, which she understood was its own kind of gratitude. The wedding was held in the ranch yard on a clear April afternoon, and it was nothing at all like the arrangement that had brought Evie west in the first place. There was no cold platform this time, no crowd gathered to laugh. Marcus and Toby had built a floral arch by hand out of white sage blossoms and wild lupine, the same sage Evie had coaxed back to life in Hannah's garden the autumn before, grown now thick and fragrant along the south wall. Gideon stood at the front to officiate, his old Bible worn soft at the corners, his voice steady the way it always was. "We're not gathered here for a transaction," he said, looking out over the 15 hands and the neighboring ranchers who had come to stand with them. "We're gathered here because a woman came to this basin as a stranger and stayed to become its heart. Some of you laughed at her once. I expect none of you are laughing now." Nobody was. Jed stood across from Evie under the arch, dressed plain but pressed his hand, steady where it had once been closed into a fist against the world. When Gideon asked if he took her, he did not hesitate. "I do," he said, "and I should have said it the first day she stepped off that train." Evie smiled, and it reached all the way up into her eyes. Afterward, while the men lit a fire in the yard, and Marcus played something slow and warm on his harmonica, Jed took her by the hand and walked her a little apart, down toward the creek where the light was going soft and gold, the way it did at the end of good days. "You didn't just save this ranch, Evie," he said, holding her under the low spring sun. "You taught me how to live, how to respect my fellow man, how to love." She leaned back against his chest and looked out over the basin, at the new barn, the green grass, the 15 men gathered by the fire who had once looked at her like something that did not belong and now looked at her like family. "I came here plain," she said quietly, "and mocked, and told I'd never belong. And this is where I'm staying." Jed held her a moment longer, the mountains catching the last of the light behind them, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The land where she had once been mocked was her home now, her family, her forever. And so the last light fell over Ironwood Basin, soft and gold, the way it only does at the end of something hard won. Evelyn Mercer did not arrive in Montana as a hero. She arrived hungry, exhausted, and publicly mocked by the very man she had come to serve. She had no land, no weapon, no allies, and no guarantee that any of it would work out. What she had was something quieter and far more durable. A willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier, to work when rest felt impossible, and to hold her head level when the whole world was laughing at her feet. That is the first lesson this story carries. Dignity is not given to you by the people around you. It is the thing you refuse to surrender, even when they try to take it. Evie never asked Jed Coulter to respect her. She simply behaved as someone worthy of respect and waited for the world to catch up. It did. But the story does not stop there, because Evie alone could not have saved Ironwood Basin. It took Gideon's quiet loyalty. It took Marcus and Toby and 15 men who had been overlooked and underpaid and still chose to stand. It took small ranchers with little to gain who rode anyway. And it took Jed Coulter, a man hardened by grief, into something almost unrecognizable, finding enough trust left inside himself to let one person back through the door. The second lesson is this: no one rebuilds anything alone. The people we dismiss as too small, too young, too broken, those are often the very ones standing in front of us with rifles raised when the moment finally comes. There is something else worth sitting with. Sterling nearly won, not through strength, but through patience and the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention. He falsified documents in a month of grief, counting on sorrow to be a kind of blindness. What stopped him was not a lawman or a gunfight, but a woman with a candle, a ledger, and the stubbornness to keep reading until the numbers told the truth. Injustice rarely announces itself. It hides in paperwork, in silence, in the spaces where people are too tired or too afraid to look. The most powerful thing a person can do, sometimes, is simply look and refuse to stop looking until they find what is being hidden. And then there is Jed, a man who had loved and lost and sealed himself off from the world so completely that his first words to a stranger were cruelty on an open platform. He is not the villain of this story. He is something sadder and more familiar, a good man so buried under grief that he had forgotten how to be one. What brought him back was not grand romance or sudden revelation. It was the daily accumulation of small dignities: a woman who cooked without being asked, who noticed a boy favoring his leg, who stood in a courtroom and defended him with the calm of someone who had already decided he was worth defending. Sometimes we are saved not by a single dramatic moment, but by someone who keeps showing up, quietly and stubbornly, until we remember who we are. This is what the American West gave us. In its best stories, not just gunfights and gold rushes, but a mirror. A landscape so unforgiving that only the truest things survived in it. Hard work, loyalty without contract, courage that does not require an audience. The willingness to build something from nothing and call it home, not because it is perfect, but because you chose it and you stayed. Evie Mercer came to Oakhaven with a carpet bag and an empty stomach. She left with a basin full of wildflowers, 15 men who called her family, and a husband who finally understood that love is not a weakness. It is the only thing strong enough to hold a person together when everything else falls apart. The land where she had once been mocked was her home now. Her family, her forever. And if this story found you at the right moment, if something in it felt less like fiction and more like a reminder, then carry it with you. You do not have to be the strongest person in the room. You do not have to arrive looking like what people expected. You only have to show up, do the work, and refuse to let anyone's laughter be the last word. That is enough. It has always been enough. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental.